Okay, so this time we're going to deal with Unit 3, and we were kind of debating how we were going to do this because it's a little bit difficult. So I think we're going to deal with the events like in 1774 to 1776 individually and kind of in chronological order. And then we'll just discuss kind of the inflection points of how inevitable was conflict at any of these points and how significant were each of these points. And if possible, who was to blame, Britain or America, in each of these points in terms of tracking it and how it would have led to the conflict. I think that's the best way to kind of handle this. And then we'll kind of debate at the end of who we think was most responsible. So first of all, obviously, Unit 3 starts from 1774. So you're dealing with the Parliament closing the Port of Boston, the Intolerable Acts coming in March 1774, and the Quebec Act in June 1774. So at this point, there's still a discussion about whether the Americans really wanted a revolution, a rebellion or not. How much do you think, how inevitable was the conflict after the Quebec Act and the Intolerable Acts, or do you think it was still salvageable at that point?
No, I think we're well on the path to war.
Yeah,
that's my opinion. And this is the preliminaries. It's a bit like if you have a fight in the schoolyard, it's a bit of pushing and shoving going on.
Yeah.
Before the real business happens.
Yeah.
So that's my opinion. I think things have really gotten out of hand after the the Boston Tea Party, terrible event by anybody's standard.
Yeah.
Now Britain is trying to sending troops, and the Americans are responding. So things are building up to an inevitable confrontation. It's my opinion.
But even later on, though, because at this point they had the first Continental Congress was called after this in September, October 1774. So we take it in chronological order. So after these events, they call the first Continental Congress. They're like, how are we going to deal with this? And they decide on an economic boycott, but they only boycott like importation of goods, which I think is really significant because the importation is obviously affecting the northern colonies' ability to manufacture and to smuggle and to do what they like, so they can still do it. But I think it's quite significant that they don't ban exports because it's vital for the southern colonies to continue to export their crops like tobacco and that to Britain and the Empire. So I think that shows divisiveness. Georgia doesn't even send a representative to the First Continental Congress because they wanted British help fighting the Native Americans in the South. So not all of them there. Most of them haven't been given permission to discuss independence at this point. So they're just coming there for it is significant. It's the first big meeting of all the colonies, and they do rally to the support of Massachusetts, which wasn't a given because I remember when I was studying it, New York, Pennsylvania, if you read their documents at the time, they were like, is Virginia on board with this? Because most of them thought Massachusetts was full of nutters, like religious nutters, great problems. And they were like, without Virginia, the big state being on board, we're not on board. And then they were happy when Virginia said, yeah, we'll defend Massachusetts, we'll come on board with this. And they obviously then set up these like, the governors start fleeing at this point, and they set up their own little local committees to basically take over the running of these colonies. But the colonies are still quite divided, and I'm still not sure that they really saw independence as a goal. Maybe so. Like maybe I was wrong to say conflict. Was independence inevitable at this point, or do you think the colonies saw themselves as pushing for something, or do you think this was just they were still thinking they could push back with the boycotts the same way they had with the Stamp Act and the Stamp Act Congress, and that Britain would back down on this?
That's a good question. I'm still inclined to think that war is really now on the horizon. I think a few years before, I don't think that independence was the declared aim of British Americans. Several years before that, but I think after this conflict, the Intolerable Acts, British repression, the First Continental Congress, I think that now this is on the cards.
Yeah, you don't think that because even in the Second Continental Congress, they petitioned the king to say, like, can you solve this problem?
Right.
So I was wondering if they're still seeing it as an inevitable. I don't know if it's inevitable. Do you? I suppose the key
it's hard to say. Yeah.
The key is the king's reaction to this, I guess, because then once this happens, the king in October, so just after the First Continental Congress is called, the king hires German Hessian soldiers. Doesn't send them to the colonies yet, but hires, and the colonies are aware that he's hiring foreign mercenaries. I think this reinforces that idea of tyranny and reinforces on the back of the Quebec Act of this imposing of foreigners. The king himself being of German descent, I wonder if that makes a difference in the minds of the colonists. This is not an English king. And then hiring German mercenaries as well. And then in the Prohibitory Act in 1775, the king passes a law saying that trade is to be cut off completely from the colonies, both imports and exports, and declares them effectively non-citizens because they're up in rebellion. So that's a year before the Declaration of Independence. So does the king effectively declare them independent himself?
Well, Britain's in a bind, isn't it? I mean, they can't simply repeal. They can't say sorry. They can't repeal the acts. That they have to maintain the authority that they have hitherto exerted and their prestige. So I'm not sure that George is really in a position to do that.
Yeah. Do you think they couldn't have repealed it? Do you think there was an option here to have like imposed something like what is the current modern Commonwealth? I know that idea for the Commonwealth came about because of what happened with America, but
right.
So it was difficult because they realized they could get the benefits of trade without paying for anything. But do you think that's a possibility at that moment?
No, not in these circumstances. I think when British honor is wounded and some kind of reprisal is necessary. But it is worth saying that when Britain eventually tries to negotiate a deal with the Americans, I think this is after Saratoga, after Burgoyne's defeat at Saratoga, and the British attempt to make peace. I think that's the scenario that we're looking at, isn't it?
Yeah. And the colonists reject it, I guess, because at that point.
That's right. They reject it because although Britain would get rid of the taxes, independence would be off the table.
Yeah.
And by that point, the Americans are committed to independence.
Yeah.
I think Washington's committed to independence.
I suppose the Declaration of Independence being made in 1776, it would be more difficult. Do you think if that deal had been offered to them now in 1774 or 5, they'd have taken it?
Oh, excellent question, James. Excellent question. Maybe. Yeah, it certainly would have strengthened the more conservative parties in the Continental Congress. Yeah. Obviously, there's political there's political battles between American British colonists who are more sympathetic to the British and those who are not, those who are inclined towards the radical side. So, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure how I would say that. It's potentially they could have stopped it. That would have been a pretty generous concession, though. And what would that do to British prestige? That would be essentially admitting that the destruction of the tea, for example, destruction of property, rebellion, is basically being rewarded by extremely generous concessions.
Do you think Britain's putting down of other, slightly off topic, but do you think they're suppressing of other colonial uprisings after the American Revolution were harsher because of the American Revolution? Or do you think it was just because they weren't British citizens?
I think it's because they weren't British citizens. I think there's a racial component here.
Yeah.
And it's important to note, I think, that, you know, if you had to bet on who's going to win a conflict, is it going to be Britain or is it going to be the 13 colonies of this new America? Most people would put their money on Britain. So most people would say that Britain has They have the cards in their hands, and that's not an unreasonable thing to think. So it's hard to imagine Britain in a position of military strength on the outset as conflict's about to beginning. It's hard to imagine Britain wanting to or being able to really make the kind of concession that would nip independence in the bud.
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine. Yeah, because obviously we know the result. I suppose it's the problem we're looking back on hindsight, because it's true that the British could never have imagined they would have lost this conflict.
And I think it's important to remember that war is basically, in most cases, war is chance. There's so much chance. The outcome of decisions, the fog of war, misunderstandings, all of these factors basically create a situation which is very difficult to predict. And I think and particularly in this war, when it comes to the War of Independence, sorry, I'm skipping ahead a bit, I know, but
but that's fine. It's a bit.
There are so many events that just seem like a fluke. Which side won, and it has a big effect on the general outcome. So
I mean, we'll get to it more when we talk about the war, but I think it's probably quite important that the British think that they're fighting a traditional war, and that by capturing the capital and knocking out the enemy, they win, because that's what European powers always do. They surrender and they give up the land. But because the Americans, do you think it's different? That is this the first war where one side is fighting what they consider to be an existential crisis rather than just a power battle? Because the Americans, it's for the nature of, they can't give in, because it's not about land and power. It's about ideology and freedom. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how many wars have been fought for freedom before. Most of them have been fought for power.
Yeah, sure. I think you could make an argument on either way on that one. To what extent are Americans fighting for some kind of ideal? I think that can be exaggerated, though. Yeah. I think there's a myth of American independence.
Yeah.
Of this kind of heroic dedication to the cause of liberty.
That's the American myth.
That's the American myth. And I think that can exaggerate the fact that that many people have many different motivations.
Yeah.
Some of which might be political, but others which are not.
Yeah. Yeah, possibly. And we'll get onto that when we talk about strengths and weaknesses. But I just think it's the nature of this war is slightly different, because I think they're still fighting. It's like the British didn't quite learn enough from the 7 Years' War to understand what's really going on over there. I think the Americans, maybe because they were there, I don't know. I feel like the Americans learned from the 7 Years' War and the British didn't. Maybe because the British won overall and gained so much territory, they didn't look at the micro level of what was going on in the battles. I'm not really sure.
But I think also it's very difficult to know. I mean, it would be a fair assumption, and I think this is what people in Britain thought, that these colonies, they're very isolated.
Yeah,
there's no unified government here. There's not even very good lines of communications between the colonies. So each of the independent colonies tended that the communication with the mother country was stronger than inter-colonial communication in many cases.
Yeah.
It was easier to get from Boston to London than Boston to Savannah.
Yeah.
So you can understand these assumptions. Now, in hindsight, it turned out not to be true, but it's a reasonable mistake to make.
Yeah, I guess they had no reason to talk to each other until this happened.
Right.
Because they've got totally different. They live in different worlds, and they've got different. I mean, you've got 3 zones. So the northern colonies would have talked to each other because they've got similar interests. Same with the southern ones. Same with the middle ones. But I don't think they saw themselves as together. I think they saw themselves as competitors on a new continent to exploit.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this will become a problem once we look at the Constitutional Convention. right? And the debate between federalists and anti-federalists.
Yeah, Unit 4 is going to be very long.
So,
yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, I think so. But I think that competitiveness is there from the very beginning, because it's quite funny. But because American history is obviously always written by the winners, and they love to tell their history through the prism of their own ideology rather than through the reality of what happened.
Right.
I mean, when we go into the civil rights course, we'll see like how they just eliminate bits of history they don't like from their own country.
Right.
Those other points.
Right.
It's quite difficult to trust the American narrative on anything. Then afterwards, obviously, you get like in April 7th, there's a big scramble for guns, weapons around Massachusetts. So I suppose that if both sides are scrambling to get hold of as many cannons, weapons as they can, I guess that kind of does suggest that there is a certain inevitability to conflict coming.
Yes,
that's right. Because you could argue, I suppose, that they were getting it for defensive purposes, but even so, you're anticipating some form of conflict coming, I think, at this point. And then they get to the fighting at Lexington and Concord, obviously, when the British are trying to stop them from getting hold of these cannons, stop them from getting hold of these arms. But obviously, the British soldiers are in terrain that's hostile to them. They're surrounded by militia. It's up in arms now. The British Army is actually stopping them taking weapons, which is probably the high motivation for the Second Amendment. And like they feel this right that they should be able to arm themselves because they see this existential threat coming in on top of that.
I think it's important to mention as well, particularly the March to Concord, Massachusetts. It's Gage, right?
Yeah.
This guy Gage, he doesn't have a lot of guys.
Yeah.
He's outnumbered in enemy territory. It's pretty bad. Like I would be absolutely terrified if I was one of those people marching to Concord.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty hair-raising experience for them, right? They get basically chased all the way back to
shot at from all sides and surrounded all areas, and there's more and more militia coming out because obviously, as the cry goes up and the push comes, that most of the locals, because the loyalists, it would have been very difficult, I think, to be a loyalist in Boston. Because I think
Absolutely.
Since the Stamp Act, you've seen people tarred and feathered, their houses burnt down, effigies hung.
It's like being a Republican in Boston today.
Yeah. Yeah. You wouldn't. I saw. Where was I? I saw we were in Bolsonaro country in Brazil, like real hardcore Bolsonaro country, and someone was going around with loads of Lula stickers all over their car, and I was like, that is it is. It'd be like being, flying Biden flags in deep Republican rural Texas or something like that, like or Mississippi, and you're just not. Yeah,
it's not a good idea. It's not a good idea. But Gage is under orders. He still represents the power of Britain, but militarily he's very weak. He's in a very bad situation. In Massachusetts, and so I think that's basically the issue.
You think this is where Britain made a strategic error in their own anticipation of their strength? Because yes, they are the global superpower, but it's not based on their army.
No,
because they're an island. So they've never needed to have an army that's any good because they don't fight land battles. They just go around by sea, conquering everything, cutting off supply lines and strangling out areas. That's their tactic. But unfortunately, when the enemy doesn't need to import anything, which the Americans don't, you've got a problem.
Yes. I think the other
French out in Quebec because the Quebecois were reliant on supplies coming in, but they can't strangle the Americans because the Americans grow their own food. They do everything. Everything's on land.
Yeah, and they used to self-rule.
Yeah. I mean, they didn't want luxuries, but you could go, if you're fighting a revolutionary war, you can deal without luxuries. You can't deal without food.
Yeah, and part of the boycott is this pride in eschewing luxuries, right?
Yeah.
In showing that you can stand up for the cause by making a few sacrifices.
Yeah, and
I suppose not drinking tea, for example.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that though, James? Not drinking tea? What a terrible thing to do.
Well, the Americans are. I mean, to be fair to the Americans, they do have that hardy pioneer toughness. I mean, that's for sure. You know what I mean? That's not a game for them. That is something that comes with the land they moved into. And again, the type of people who went there. You know what I mean? If you were kind of like weak in that, you wouldn't have gone to America, and if you had, you probably would have died. So it's like, it's like you have to have that pioneering spirit to survive that hostility of the early territories.
Yeah.
This was, this was no picnic out on the western front of the Americas at this point.
But it's worth, so in terms of kind of assessing the outcome of this, what happens is Britain basically gives up on New England. And
although that comes after Bunker Hill, so
sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Okay,
I mean, but it was kind of, but I think you're right, as in it was kind of obvious they didn't have, if you're being shot at from like absolutely everyone, and you're like it's like fighting a guerrilla war in enemy territory. It's not a good idea.
No.
But Massachusetts was always, and that's the difference with the colonies, they were always more rebellious, more. The Great Awakening had been there. The idea of throwing off authority had been there. They were seen as more radical. It was seen as like, real radical politics. These would have been, in the 20th century, these would have been like the communists. The rest of the country would have gone, oh my God, these are the radical, like Bernie Sanders supporters up there in the north.
Well, do you know where Bernie Sanders is from?
Yeah, I know. He's from up there. He's from Vermont.
From Vermont.
One of the ones up there. Yeah.
He's from Vermont, right?
Yeah, Samuel Adams was clearly the Bernie Sanders of that time period.
Totally, exactly. Yeah.
So you got Samuel Adams is radical. We're going to overthrow not just the British, but all authority and and like people in power. And I don't think the Southern colonies were interested in that.
No, but as you say, what's remarkable is not the radicalism in Massachusetts, but the fact that the other colonies, particularly the plantation colonies to the south, threw their lot in with Massachusetts.
Yeah. Opportunism, or like they saw the writing on the wall and were like, we'll have a piece of that, or just gambling, or ideology.
Maybe I'd say a bit of a combination of those qualities, but it would be a reason. Well, again, I don't want to jump ahead. I keep wanting to jump ahead. I really want to talk
back and forth as we're going through this, because I think that's why I said like doing this one in the format was difficult, because it was like, what format is the best way to go?
But it's important that Washington is from Virginia, I think.
Yeah. Well, and Jefferson and
Madison. I don't think can you imagine if they'd chosen someone from Massachusetts? I really don't think that would be the same. I don't think that would be a good idea. And I'm not sure how unifying that would be.
No, it wouldn't be. They would never. No, I mean, I've read the diaries of people in New York and Pennsylvania. They would not have joined the revolution if it was led by Massachusetts. They would not have done. They out and out said, Virginia leads this, or we don't join it.
Yeah,
I mean, that was my undergrad dissertation, was on how Virginia was more important than Massachusetts. It's just like the Boston. They lost the Civil War. If Lee had been on the other side in the Civil War, Virginia would still be hailed as really important in there. But losing the Civil, you don't lose in America. If you lose in American history, your place is gone at the table. It's like they don't celebrate losers. So losing on the Civil War means Virginia is out of American history, and Boston, Massachusetts must be the heroes.
Yeah, I haven't thought of that, but that's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
That's why I wrote my dissertation, because it basically was like two reasons why they wrote Virginia out. And social historians in the 20th century like to portray the American Revolution as a class rebellion, but that was only the case in Massachusetts. It was not the case in the South. So being Americans, they have the choice. Change our historical narrative to fit the reality, or change the reality to fit the historical narrative. And the Americans decided to change the reality. So like they just said, oh, well, Virginia wasn't important. That's why it doesn't matter that they didn't remove their colonial elites.
Yeah.
So,
do you want to go? Do you want to do the Battle of Bunker Hill?
Well, a second Continental Congress first, I think. So, like just after Lexington. Okay. So the second Continental Congress is called after the first shots are fired, and I think this is significant in looking at like where things have gone, because at the second Continental Congress they send the olive branch petition to the king to say, what are you doing? Stop Parliament, stop this from happening. We are your loyal subjects. Why are you kind of booting us out of the empire? And like, we don't want this to go any further. Because I suppose they would still see Lexington and Concord as defensive at this point. Eh? I don't think they would see it as them attacking the British. They would see it as them defending their right to control their guns, hence the Second Amendment. And I think then the Second Continental, when we get to the Bill of Rights, we'll talk about how these amendments will link into these things. The Second Continental Congress does, however, create an army, does elect George Washington to lead it, which I think is fundamentally important, because it was going to be Gates leading it, but Gates wanted money, and they said no. Washington offered to do it for free, which says a lot about his character and probably why he was chosen. Also, he had experience in the British Army, I think in the 7 Years' War, he almost got a promotion. If he got a promotion, he probably would have won on the other side. That would have been very interesting to see how the war would have gone if Washington actually been in the British Army. So that was one promotion mistake.
It might not have gone well for the British. I don't.
He did lose all his battles. That's true.
Yes, given that Washington has a skill for losing.
He does. Battles. He must be the. He's the only person to have lost like almost every battle he's ever fought and yet won every war.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they pick him. Right. They create.
No, he's a man of a lot of virtues, I think. But I don't think winning battles is one of them.
No. We'll talk about. I mean, I don't think anyone. I think he's unique, and even when reading his diaries, it's like all the others are talking about these great ideologies and the battles and the clashes of our time and everything. And I read Washington's diary. It's like, went out today, shot a couple of rabbits, chopped down a tree. I don't know what the fuss is about. My country's not going to go to war. It's like, gotta love him. Just a very simple man, but a good man, I think. And then and they create a navy, which of course is like, kind of pointless.
What would that navy be? Was it a small paddle boat?
Yeah, whatever they can swim together. Was it John Paul Jones was doing his pirating down the coast of Britain? I don't think they like to say this was great, but I'm really not sure the American Navy played a blockade running. I guess blockade running and getting through smuggled stuff. I suppose that's what the Navy's main job was. Because it's not, there's no way the American Navy can compete.
There's no military capacity for the American Navy. They don't really have one.
No. You can't create from scratch something to compete with the world's biggest Navy. It's not going to do anything. But it's symbolic. It's symbolic still. I think the creation of the army is there. George Washington, they can raise money as well.
Yeah.
But through borrowing and through printing money, which we'll get to in Unit 4, there's a lot of problems.
Yeah, have some fake money to fight my army.
Well, I was trying to explain to my students, it was a bit like if you went into a shop today and said, here's some Monopoly money. Trust me, in a few years' time, it'll be worth something.
That's right. And in fact, that leads to problems. Like there are, in fact,
we'll deal with that massively.
But
now it's good because they can get some money, albeit they never managed to fully arm Washington, provide him with clothes, anything, because they couldn't agree on it. And again, the funding had to be university agreed. And then they relied on donations from the states, which of course is
much. Not very reliable, is it?
No, well, it's all relative to when the fighting was on their territory, they suddenly donated stuff. When it wasn't, they didn't, because there was again no unity between them. I think at least they were all there. I think Georgia was there in the second one, so that makes a difference. But we can talk about that. But I think the fact that it's a mixed message. So which do you think is the more important? They create the army, they appoint George Washington to lead it, but they send the olive branch petition to the king to say, let's stop this. Do you think it's precautionary to appoint the army, or do you think the olive branch petition is not genuine? You think they're doing both at the same time?
I think the olive branch petition is very important. It's a good piece of evidence against the argument that war is inevitable, even at this point, at least from the point of view of the Americans.
Yeah.
Now, it's really George III's response to the olive branch petition, which is decisive, right?
Yeah.
Which is he ignores it, doesn't he?
Yeah,
I mean, he's not able. He can't really recognize this political body.
No, it's like kind of, who are you to write to me? I mean, he doesn't have the authority to do it. Do you think also he might have been aware that he doesn't actually have the constitutional authority to do anything with this, or do you think it's more?
Well, I think the problem is if you responded to it, then you're giving this new political body a kind of legitimacy.
Yeah.
That you're not prepared to give it.
Yeah.
You're making some kind of concession, and I think I don't think George. But of course, the consequence of George III not listening to the petition means that any the moderate factions in the Continental Congress really don't have a leg to stand on anymore.
No, and they feel abandoned by their father figure.
Yeah.
Do you think also they think they have the right to petition for this, though? Do you think they see this as further tyranny, that the king doesn't even listen to their petition?
That it's tyranny from George III?
Yeah.
No, I'm quite skeptical about this.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody knows that I'm sure. I I don't think the Americans are so stuck in their pre-Glorious Revolution mentality that they don't realize that George III, in fact, doesn't. He's a figurehead. It's Parliament that is. It's Parliament where the buck stops. And
I'm still not sure the Americans understand this, though.
Well, I wonder, and it is interesting. I mean, of course, in the Declaration of Independence, it's a set of complaints.
Yeah,
there's a long list of complaints addressed to George III.
Yeah.
But of course, all of the complaints before that, in the Stamp Act, for example, and Townsend duties, that's addressed to Parliament. It's not George III.
Yeah, but that's because Parliament's taxing them and they're saying you don't have the right to do this. Then I think that they go above it to the king. I think the Declaration of Independence to the king suggests that they don't respect, they don't understand. I think it's further evidence that and the Olive Branch petition are two really strong pieces of evidence to think that they still think the king is above Parliament.
Yeah, I wonder.
I still think they think Parliament's the same as their colonial assemblies, and they still think there's this weird upstart like a colonial assembly of England.
I mean,
what they should be doing.
It's bizarre to think that a bunch of Whigs, American Whigs, right, would appeal to a king over parliamentary authority in England. I think there's something quite odd about that. It's always
they're just a bit backward, aren't they? They're behind the times in what's gone on. Because they won't, I don't think they had a real, I think they understood it sort of, but didn't really. I guess if you're not living in England, would you really understand the consequences of what's shifted? Did the ordinary people in England understand the shift?
Good question. Yeah.
Because they still look to the monarch as the figurehead of the country, even now, you know what I mean? And certainly back then.
Yeah. But there's still the act, is it called the Act of Settlement?
Yeah, but the question is, was it a public, was it, obviously the machinations of everyone in government would know what's happened, but would the ordinary people, especially in a time when there was basically no democracy and you didn't really vote, would they have cared and would they have known? Because it wouldn't have changed anything to their day-to-day life.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that, but it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, they couldn't write, so we can't even check their diaries. So it's like, it would be interesting to know. That's quite a fundamental piece of information. Did the ordinary people know or care or aware of what had gone on?
Right.
So I don't know, but the Second Continental Congress is kind of fails, and then it leads to the Battle of Bunker Hill, which I think is really important, and that's like the kind of outbreak of conflict one out there. So obviously, then Bunker Hill occurs when the Americans take a cannon up to the top of the hill overnight, which Gates says, "Oh my God, I couldn't have got my men to do that in a week." So he was impressed with their motivation to get up the hill. This cannon then obviously is overlooking Boston Harbor, which means the ships are in danger, which means they can't keep them in the harbor because obviously they can be blown apart when the Americans don't have the chance to knock down ships otherwise. And then that's the fatal attempt where they attack up the hill and they make the assault on the hill, the British soldiers, believing they can obviously overrun these colonial soldiers very easily. And the colonial soldiers defend their position and succeed in standing their ground and inflicting higher casualties on the British army than they received themselves. The British are forced to retreat. And then obviously after that retreat, they are forced to evacuate the port of Boston, which I think is really important because once the hill is taken, they can't protect themselves. They realize that this area is completely uncontrollable and that they've lost basically Massachusetts. Massachusetts is totally over to the other side. And they have to withdraw to New York, which is obviously a much more loyal colony and was British possession throughout the whole of the war. So how significant was this event?
How's you take me by surprise, James? You need the upward intonation in your voice.
So, how significant was the event?
Realize that this is a question. Maybe your students are familiar.
Not Australian. That's the problem. Not middle class.
No, I don't mean speaking with upward inflection all the time. Just when you have a question, that's not an unreasonable request.
I don't do inflections. I noticed when I was teaching English, it was a problem because I couldn't teach intonation because I don't have any. I don't think working class English people have intonation. I think this is a middle class construct. But anyway, that's a different debate. So how important is Bunker Hill?
Oh, I think it's the conclusion to this. I think it's important in that it represents the final withdrawal of British from Boston.
Mm.
That's it. That's it for New England. Now we're going to move to a new phase. But I think it's the olive branch proposal. I think it's the Second Continental Congress.
Yeah.
Where I think this decision is now being made.
Yeah. So you consider Bunker Hill, rather than to be the end of the start of the war, to be the start of the actual war.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's how I see it.
So that's the break point where we're now at war.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you don't consider Lexington and Concord to be fully at war because of the Olive Branch petition in the second.
Yeah, not yet. Not yet.
So it's George III's response to the Second Continental Congress that kicks it in. And the Declaration of Independence obviously doesn't come till a year later. So we're at war when they're already at war when
that's
made.
Right. Yeah. That's right. That's right.
And who's most to blame for this kickoff? Do we still think it's the underlying factors that they don't understand each other, or has it now changed? Is it British actions or American responses?
I think you could make a good case that George III's unwillingness to respond to the Olive Branch petition, basically represents the loss of the final opportunity to salvage some kind of agreement before real hostilities break out. Yeah, I think that's what I would argue.
I think there's a strong case for that. I think the Prohibitory Act of 1775, like literally cutting them off from trade with the empire and basically declaring them non-citizens. Yeah. I think if you declare them non-citizens, they now no longer have a choice, because they're not going to be negotiated back in. So it's like now they're like, well, we're outside. We've got to fight for something, or we're going to be in real trouble. And that hiring of the Hessian mercenaries as well, I think really just drums home that despotism.
Yeah. I wouldn't use the word despotism. I think that's colonial propaganda, really. I don't think there's much despotism going on.
No, but they believe
but that's what they think. I know, but they're nuts.
Yeah, but perception is very important. Like, even if it's not the reality of the thing, the perception, because people act not on reality. People act on their perception of reality.
That's right. No, that's right. But again, politically, there is still a party of elites, of American British elites, that might have been prepared, that were unwilling to go to war, but without any way of negotiating some kind of settlement, some kind of agreement. It's in the hands of the war party.
Yeah. So we both agree it's kind of Britain. The Americans were just still continuing what they've always said. It's Britain that escalates it.
I think so.
Yeah. And am I wrong? But didn't Patrick Henry and John Dickinson end up being on the loyalist side? Both the ones with no taxation without representation, which is why they're not considered top founding fathers.
I don't think, were they? I don't know.
Sure. I don't think they were.
I thought John Dickinson wasn't John Dickinson an anti-federalist? I have to look this up. I shouldn't say this on recording.
yeah. We'll have to check this. That's something we need.
Don't listen. Yeah, that's right.
That last bit is speculation on our part. But there were definitely prominent people calling for no taxation without representation who ended up being loyalists, did not side with the independence fighters.
Yeah. So maybe it's worth looking at. Shall we turn to the strengths and weaknesses?
Yep. Kind of 1 minute left, so we can end this one, and then it makes a nice break point. So
maybe we should end it now and then
we'll take it there to end this one. I think that was quite good, and I think we both agree the British escalated it at this point, but I still think the underlying tensions are still important. Because do you think the British, well, let's finish on that last minute, do you think the British escalated it and the Americans accepted it because they didn't understand each other? Or do you think, because I think fundamentally, if they still didn't understand each other, the underlying factors is the main point. Even though the British escalated it, they escalated it because they didn't understand what the Americans were really thinking.
Yeah, I think you have to argue your premise first. Yeah. And whatever you begin with is going to determine whether you're going to say it's British escalation or underlying tensions.
Yeah. Or unreasonable American reactions. But I think at this point, the British have put them in a position where they don't have a choice.
I think so.
Because it's like they didn't declare independence, they got kicked out.
Yeah.
Which I think is fundamentally a bigger issue. All right, cool. We'll end that one. We'll start the next one for the war.